You're listening to World in Focus on Radio Sputnik. It's 16 minutes past the hour. Given the dubious track record of large ships and icebergs, you might not think it would be the best idea in the world to drag a 1 billion tonne iceberg all the way from Antarctica and into one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, especially when the temperature at your destination port can reach 50 degrees Celsius. But that's exactly what an ambitious company from the United Arab Emirates plans to do in a bid to solve the country's fresh water shortage. Our reporter Mark Hurst takes a cold, hard look at whether this proposal may prove too hot to handle.
Ambitious plans to tow an iceberg from Antarctica to the United Arab Emirates in the Middle East have been unveiled this week. The proposals by UAE company, the National Advisor Bureau Limited, based in Masdar City, involve towing an iceberg with 20 million gallons of water to the Arab state that would secure enough fresh water to supply 1 million people for 5 years. If achieved, it would be the largest single object ever towed, and the company planned to begin the project in early 2018. The operation to drag the iceberg to the United Arab Emirates is estimated to take a full year. Once off the coast, large slabs of ice above the waterline would be split off, filtered and crushed down to make clean, fresh drinking water. Abdullah Mohammed Al-Sheikh, the managing director of the company behind the project, believes they can get the iceberg to the UAE before the gargantuan object literally evaporates under the hot Arab sun. He even believes the arrival of an iceberg off the coast of the UAE would attract tourism and may even result in a microclimate being established that could lead to regular rains. So is this proposal likely to remain afloat, or, like a certain famous luxury liner, doomed to sink beneath the waves? Well, earlier I spoke with Doug Allan, the award-winning wildlife cameraman and marine biologist who has over 35 years' experience of working in both the Antarctic and Arctic and understands the significant technical challenges of operating in that part of the world. Doug Allan, aren't you shaken or stirred by these proposals to tow an iceberg from Antarctica to the Middle East?
Well, it's quite an idea. It's not the first time it's been proposed, actually. Back in the 70s, the Saudis had the idea of doing something similar. I'm not sure if they were going to come from the Arctic or the Antarctic, but it never came to anything in the end. And I think you'd have to tow them, to be honest, from the Antarctic, simply because they're bigger down there. You get much bigger icebergs in the Antarctic than you do being spawned in the Arctic. And it would be quite a challenge getting that sort of volume of fresh water, that tonnage of fresh water, all the way from the Antarctic up to off the Indian Ocean side of the UAE. You really have to look at the currents very carefully because, as you know, 7/8 of an iceberg is actually underwater. So they're much more affected by the currents that you're trying to pull them against or pull them with than they are by any sort of conditions topside, weather-wise topside. And of course, as you hold it towards up through the tropics, then you would be faced with warmer water and therefore melting under the sea surface. It would be melting. The bit that was submerged would be melting, as well as the topside would be melting, obviously, from the sun. And that would be interesting because that would mean that the centre of buoyancy of the iceberg was changing. So therefore it would be tending to roll around in the water and become less stable. And icebergs themselves are quite unstable objects, even big ones. Once they break free of the Antarctic ice shelves, then there's all kinds of stresses and strains that run through the iceberg, and therefore the chances of it breaking up into much smaller icebergs while it was being towed would be quite an issue.
You've experienced the amazing sight of glaciers calving, and they seem a little bit unpredictable, to say the least, and can rotate as well as just bits breaking off. How big of a technical challenge is that?
Well, exactly. The fact is that when an iceberg breaks off, an iceberg's obviously floating, and it therefore has a centre of buoyancy, which is an actual spot in the very middle of the iceberg. And if you start melting the outside, then that centre of buoyancy can begin to change, and that can make the iceberg, even big icebergs, very, very unstable. There are stresses in the ice when it breaks away from the ice shelf, and as you melt the outside, those stresses and strains change. And there are cases of quite large icebergs just breaking up and splintering into very much smaller icebergs in a very, very short period period of time. And when you think of all the stresses and strains that would be put upon an iceberg, towing it across rough seas, towing it through seas that were a lot warmer, rough seas, what have you, then it would not be a stable thing to tow, especially the sort of distances that you're talking about from the Antarctic all the way to the UAE. I mean, we're talking about, 60, 70, 80 degrees of latitude. So we're talking about, several thousand miles of a tow. There are very, very significant problems, not least of which, obviously, is the weight of it. It's interesting that the UAE people are talking about towing an iceberg that would give them 20 billion gallons of water. Well, 20 billion gallons of water, that means you're talking about towing something which is about 100 million tons in weight. And as far as I know, no one's ever tried to tow anything in the water that sort of size. Now, icebergs they are tugged and towed and pushed out of the way in certain parts of the Arctic, where icebergs can be threatening oil installations, for example. Then there are tugs and boats which will go out and will push the iceberg in a certain direction so that the current then carries it clear of the oil rigs. But the sort of icebergs you're talking about there are not nearly as big as the sort of things that the UAE is proposing to take up off to their coasts.
And the Antarctic ice shelf is a huge area, so it would seem unlikely the removal of one iceberg every 5 years would have a significant environmental impact. But if more Middle East countries began doing this on a more regular basis, could that have an environmental impact on Antarctica?
No, I don't think so, to be honest. You can talk about the sort of iceberg. I mean, even an iceberg that weighs 100 million tons isn't necessarily that big when you actually work out the volume. I mean, don't forget that these icebergs, the average sort of iceberg that they would be trying to tow would be showing 30 metres of height, perhaps between 20 and 30 metres of height above the water, but then you would have 7 times as much depth down below it. And even that sort of volume wouldn't be a significant removal. That wouldn't make much difference to the overall volume of ice in the Antarctic, but it would obviously have some effect as to how close you could get it to shore. I'm not sure what the undersea topography is off the coast of Fujairah. Fujairah is the Indian Ocean coastline that the UAE has, so you'd have to bring it in close, presumably until it almost grounded, and then you would have to start chipping bits of the iceberg off. I've no doubt that the sums have been done in terms of how much volume you would lose to melting above the ice, above the water surface, and then melting in the tropics. You could work out how much volume you would actually lose, but I think the big problem with towing it would be just it breaking up while you towed it, and also the fact that it would be changing its centre of buoyancy, and the fact that this is just an enormous lump of ice to drag up there. As I say, the idea's come up before. It bounces in and out of the literature and in and out of science fiction periodically over the last 40 or 50 years, and so far nothing has really come of it. I mean, the Australians looked at it from bringing icebergs up, because obviously Australia is a lot closer to the Antarctic than the Arab Emirates is, and they looked at it and it never came to anything. But I'll be very interested to see if this proposal does actually go ahead and they try to do something next year with it.
And finally, is there not a bit of an irony here that it's a major oil-producing country that's looking to benefit from the breakup of Antarctica, especially since they've done so much to damage the environment?
Well, that's right, yeah. There's no doubt that climate change across the world is affecting the Antarctic, and particularly the Antarctic Peninsula, and there is evidence that generally the warming of the Antarctic is leading to at least some of these big ice shelves breaking up, particularly in the Weddell Sea area. So it's ironic that, yes, the UAE, one of the world's major oil producers, should now be turning to the Antarctic and looking for ways to produce fresh water from the fact that the Antarctic ice shelf is spawning more large bergs than it used to.
Doug Allan, it's a pleasure to speak to you again on World in Focus.
My pleasure.